Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Reader Journey podcast. Today, we have Christian Busch, author of the Serendipity Mindset. Christian, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Christian, your book is all about creating more good luck, but you actually start the book by talking about how you had a close encounter with bad luck, which was like a car crash, and how that led you to studying more about serendipity and luck. Can you kind of dive into that story and your journey?
Yeah, absolutely. I was this kind of teenager who lived into the day, quite reckless, and I was kicked out of school. I had to repeat a year, and then I transferred this into my driving style, probably held the unofficial world records of how many dustbins you can knock over on your way to school when you're driving. And then one day I wasn't that lucky anymore and smashed into four parked cars, all cars completely destroyed, including my own. And I won't forget the police officer who came to the scene. He looked at the car and he was like, "Oh my God, he's still alive." And this idea that I was supposed to be dead, that stuck with me. And it kind of, I had all these weird questions up in my head in terms of if I would have died, was it all worth it? Did I do anything meaningful? And I only had depressing answers at that point. And so it took me on this intense search for meaning. And I started reading this amazing book, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which is all about how do we find meaning in crisis? And it really helped me to somehow figure out, okay, what is it that gives me meaning in life? And I realized it's so much about connecting people, connecting ideas. And so a lot of kind of what I've been working on over the last years and decade is really very much related to connecting ideas, connecting people, and serendipity, popped up everywhere.
Yeah, and yeah, it's pretty incredible, and that's kind of one of the main themes in your book. That just because you had some bad luck, that doesn't mean that bad luck's permanent. Like you said, that bad luck kind of results in a positive outcome, and that's something I definitely want to talk in a little bit later. But I think a lot of people listening to this conversation might be thinking, "Oh, like serendipity or luck is like it's random. It's not like something you could kind of control." And I'm sure part of luck is kind of like complete random, but there's also a part, like you say, you call it smart luck in your book. So can you kind of define the difference between like blind luck and smart luck?
Absolutely. And, blind luck really being this luck, like being born into a great family or things that we really don't choose, right? It's just passive, it's just happening to us. And then serendipity really as this active smart luck that's all about seeing something in the moment and then connecting the dots. So, take the example of a couple of decades ago, some researchers giving people medication against angina, and then they realized, oh wow, there's some kind of movement happening in male participants' trousers. And that was unexpected, right? And they could have just ignored it, or they could have said, "Oh my God, this is so embarrassing. Let's find a better way to cure angina without that kind of quote unquote side effect." But they said, "You know what? Actually, there's probably a lot of men in the world who might have a problem in that department. So why don't we try to figure out if that could be a medication in itself?" And that's how unexpectedly Viagra evolved, right? So what happened here is that what people did is they made an accident meaningful. They imbued meaning in that accident by connecting the dots to something relevant. And that's how a lot of innovations and inventions happen. But also, when we think about our lives, right? Maybe the way we found love or our investor or our co-founder, like a lot of these things are in the unexpected. Something unexpected happens, but it's our proactive decisions that then turn it into that kind of luck. And so it's really that, to your point, interplay between something random happening but then our response to it defining the outcome.
Yeah, and just like you mentioned about the story about Viagra, and yeah, I was really blown away to find out. I believe it was like 30 or 50% was like scientific breakthroughs are like accidental, like they're all luck. But you also have the story about I'm gonna blunder this experiment, but I believe it had something to do with like rabbits, and then both two scientists discovered it, but then one actually acted on it, and he ended up winning the Nobel Prize. And it's kind of not just discovering that luck; is kind of doing something with it. Yeah, and that was like a really interesting part of the book as well.
Absolutely. And that's the fascinating thing, I think, from a research perspective, in terms of saying, how can we know the difference between serendipity missed and serendipity gained, right? Because a lot of times in life, we just miss serendipity. We either we didn't really see it, right, in the moment, and I'll give you an example in a second, or we don't really have the persistence to really go through with it. And in that particular experiment, or in that example, what was fascinating was exactly that two researchers at the same time injected rabbits with papain, and both saw these kind of rabbits' ears flopping, but only one of them actually kind of followed through and said, "Oh my God, maybe that has to do with like bloodstream and XYZ." And then kind of they developed this amazing arthritis medication that won a lot of prizes and so on. And I think it's really this where then we can understand, oh, if you have two people who have exactly the same unexpected moment, but react differently to it, we can then trace that and find that. And, I think we all have that in our own lives. I mean, imagine that kind of situation, if you have erratic hand movements like I do, imagine the situation where you spill coffee over someone in a coffee shop, and you sense there might be some kind of connection with that person. You don't know what it is. It's just like in your gut something, maybe there's something. Now you have two options, right? Option number one is you just say, I'm so sorry, here's a napkin. You walk outside and you think, what could have happened had I spoken with a person? And then option number two, you start a conversation, that person becomes the love of your life, your co-founder, you name it. And the point here is, again, the reaction to the unexpected moment really shaping a lot of that outcome.
Yeah, and I really like how in your book you kind of break it down to like a formula where you have you need a trigger, you need to connect the dots, and you need tenacity. Could you kind of dive into and kind of explain that formula?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really something where the idea is that usually there's something that's random that's happening, right? Some kind of trigger, like this kind of spilling the coffee or movement in male participants' trousers or something else that's kind of just unexpected. And then it's up to us to do something with it, to connect the dots to something meaningful, to something relevant, and then have the tenacity to really go through with it. And, I think what's exciting about this is that when you trace back a lot of these kind of serendipitous inventions, innovations, but also when people have their own personal serendipity stories, what it shows us is it's not only this one moment. It's not only the moment of bumping into someone at a conference. It's essentially the process of doing something with that moment of bumping into someone. And I think that's fascinating. And especially also for introverts, right? Like I always assumed before I dove deeper into this, this is so much about extroversion and interacting with people. But no, like closet introverts like myself, a lot of serendipity happens when you read a book or when you take another street to work and you see something in the bookstore and you're like, oh my God, like people haven't talked about this for ages. This should be a podcast, So it's kind of these things where we can connect the dots from silent sources, from calm sources as well.
Yeah, I really enjoy how you break that down. And I want to touch about something you just talked about, which is kind of being alert and like keeping an eye out for like events that are happening to you. And that plays a big role in increasing serendipity. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is there's one of my favorite experiments actually is about exactly that kind of alertness and also in a way the way we frame the world. The more we look at the world as something that has potentiality, that there could be something out there, the more it starts to happen. And so in this one experiment, they took someone who self-identifies as lucky. Someone says, good things tend to happen to me and so on. And someone who self-identifies as very unlucky. So bad things tend to happen to me. I'm always in accidents and so on. And we both know people on that spectrum, right? Like on that kind of continuum, like we can probably place people on that. And so now the researcher tells both people, walk down the street, go into a coffee shop, order a coffee and sit down, and then we'll have our interview. Now, what he doesn't tell them is that there's hidden cameras along the streets and inside the coffee shop. There's a 5-pound note, so money, in front of the coffee shop. And inside the coffee shop, the seat that's empty is next to this extremely successful businessman who can make big dreams happen. Now, the lucky person walks down the street, sees the 5-pound note, picks it up, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, sits next to the businessman, engages him in the conversation, they exchange business cards, potential opportunity coming out of it. We don't know that. The unlucky person walks down the street, steps over the 5-pound note, so doesn't see it, goes inside the shop, orders a coffee, sits next to the businessman, ignores the businessman, and that's that. Now, at the end of the day, they ask both people, so how was your day today? And so the lucky person says, well, it was amazing. I found money in the street, made a new friend, and, potentially an opportunity coming out. The unlucky person just says, well, nothing really happened. And especially the first part, right? The first part was about, do I see something, even when someone, a lot of times, the amount of times I've found money in the street, the amount of times, it's crazy how much money people drop, right? Because, imagine how, it's just in people's pockets. But the point here being the alertness to the unexpected. Once you start seeing that the unexpected happens all the time, you also then kind of get into the mode as, oh, actually great, like I can do something with this and this and this, and then serendipity starts to happen all the time.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite experiments in the book. Like the lucky person, they go to a coffee shop, they find the money, they sit next to the businessman, and they make like, a new connection. But if you're that unlucky person, or you identify as unlucky, what kind of things can people do to kind of shift that mindset and develop, as you say, the serendipity mindset?
I'm a big fan of simple practices, not kind of shifting one's whole life or, kind of like doing like a big picture move or something, really like small behavioral changes. So, for example, one of the things that I found extremely helpful to do is to start with like small things. Like, for example, writing down what are 3 things I'm interested in at the moment. Like in my case, for example, I'm super excited at the moment thinking about how can I take the serendipity mindset into as many curricula and organizations as I can. Like that's kind of like in a way something that I try to build into every conversation in some way. And so if you write down these kind of 3 key interest areas, and then every conversation you have now, you're just seeding a little bit of this into a side sentence. And it will be surprising how many times people will be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. I was just developing a new curriculum. You should stop by, whatever it is. And I learned that from a great friend of mine in London called Ollie Barrett. And, he has really perfected this quote unquote hook strategy, which is all about essentially, if you would ask him, what do you do, Ollie? He wouldn't just say, I'm a technology entrepreneur. He would say, I'm a technology entrepreneur, recently started playing the piano, but what I'm really excited about is reading about the philosophy of science. And so what he's doing here is he's giving you 3 potential hooks where you could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. I recently started hosting piano matinees. You should come by. My God, such a coincidence. My sister is teaching the philosophy of science. You should give a guest lecture. The point here is that we can cast these hooks for other people to pick them up and connect the dots for us. So I think that's one of the practices I like the most, because you're not only reacting to something random, but actually you're creating a positive accident. You're creating a meaningful accident to happen. There's a lot of other things I think in terms of practices, but one thing, the more I've been looking into these questions, that I found more and more interesting is actually the more deeper underlying psychological limiting beliefs that we all have, right? If you think back to the coffee shop situation, where you are in this coffee shop and maybe you sense that there might be an opportunity in this situation, but you don't act on it. Or let's say you sit in a meeting and you have a random idea, but you don't say it because you feel either not worthy, not ready, not like it's not mature enough, whatever it is. And really, I've become a big fan of saying, okay, let's write down those moments where we knew there could have been something, but we didn't act on it. And then let's try to understand the pattern behind it. What is holding us back? And then really diving deeper into this and working on this. And I think what that does is it's not only then about tactical small things, but it's really about shifting your mindset towards how to actually become luckier. And then once you become luckier, actually you start believing in it more and more. And then you get there more and more.
Yeah, 'cause I know, I'm sure a lot of people and myself, we love that book, Mindset by Cal Dweck, and you develop this growth mindset. But I think the next step is also developing this serendipity mindset, where you kind of look at your life, kind of look at what's happening to you, and then try, like you said, it's like, what are some possible missed opportunities, and how can I act on those? And I think another great tip you have is to start a serendipity journal where you can actually write things down and kind of keep track about in them. Could you kind of share like a few more of the pros of starting a serendipity journal?
Absolutely. And I think the things I mentioned earlier, like writing down one's interest and really having that almost not necessarily as an elevator pitch, but as something that you have on top of your mind, that when someone asks you about, hey, what do you do? Or, hey, like, what are you interested in? That you directly have the kind of things. I think that's something that in a serendipity journal one can put down, right? So what are the key themes I'm interested in? But then also exactly these kind of patterns, just like journaling from time to time. Oh, what is it that not only what is holding me back, but also, hey, in those situations where serendipity happened, what did I do and how can I do more of that? Is there something that I'm doing intuitively that seems to work really well? But also then, of course, learning from others how we can do more of this. But the core point of the serendipity journal really is to say that this is about building a muscle. It's about kind of working out. It's like going to the gym, right? You can't expect that from one day to the other you're kind of this bodybuilding type person. You have to work on it and do a couple of exercises, and after you're building that muscle for it. And so the serendipity mindset is about that, like having a couple of practices that you do every week and then noting down how that worked or how it didn't work, and then finding the ones that work best for you. And I think that's what I found most interesting, because one thing that I focused a lot on was to say, okay, if we have this science-based framework for cultivating serendipity and we have these inspiring stories, that's great. But what are tangible exercises we can all do? And one thing that I found really interesting there is I think it depends on our personality traits a little bit on how comfortable we feel with which exercise, right? So if you're more the kind of extrovert, out there type person, it's easier for you to switch how you ask questions away from what you do to, what inspired you about XYZ situation or what's on your mind or just something that opens up that opportunity frame. But if you're more kind of, like in a way, slightly kind of not necessarily shy, but if you feel you want to tackle situations with less speed in a way, then you might prefer other things. And so I think what I found fascinating is that I think there's practices for everyone that could work. And especially for introverts, I think it's something that I've just enjoyed figuring out and learning from others. What are things they do to have more serendipity without having to necessarily now be at every party and walking around? And so simple things, right? Like talking with a host at the beginning of a party and having them then walk around with your idea and talk about your idea with others and stuff like that, which essentially you're outsourcing some of the things to people who might be more extroverted.
Mm. Yeah, and that's one thing I really enjoyed about your book is one, the practical exercises, and two, like you give advice for both people and like in different personalities, like you said, introverted, extroverted. And speaking of extroverted people, there's also like the study that found like lucky people smile twice as often. They have more open body language. Do you think that just kind of attracts more people into your life and that creates more luck, or what's kind of the science behind that?
Well, it's interesting because if you think about it, like when are you more likely to do someone a favor, for example, or when do you have more incentive to connect the dots for someone? It's usually when you like them, when you feel that's a nice person, like I want to help them out. And so I think a lot of these kind of studies are a lot about that point that the more we like someone or the more someone seems trustworthy and so on, the more we are then in a position to actually do something for them and vice versa. And so in a way, we're building a bit of that kind of field that allows us to have more serendipity because of those kind of different factors. I'm a big believer, I'd rather have someone not smile than have a fake smile, for example. So I think there's a lot around the science also of authenticity, right? Of making sure that you'd rather have a grumpy but funny person, right, than like a kind of whatever fake type person. So I think there's a lot behind also that depending on how we are as a person to not force ourselves into particular, you have to smile more type situations, but actually more around, no, like what is the bigger picture? The bigger picture, to exactly your point, is to say, what are ways of building trust with other people? And some ways like this is, right, that you're not hiding behind something, but that you're actually more open to conversation, which is what some of these kind of practices were about.
Yeah, and I think it's especially powerful if you combine like multiple tips. Like it's great to be extroverted, but if you combine like the hooks you mentioned, where instead of just answering a simple question with, I'm a technology owner, you say, I'm a technology owner, I'm an author, I study this subject. It gives people more like aspects of your personality, and they could kind of like hook onto the part they find interesting, and then you build a relationship from there. So I think, combining kind of the advice you give to people, and I think you also mentioned it's called you compound your serendipity. So combining the tips just makes it even more powerful. And I think that's a wonderful tip in your book as well.
And that's where it gets really exciting, I think, right? That in a way, it's this funny thing that once you start with that kind of like initiating some serendipity, it really is compounding, right? And you will hear then some people literally would say, oh my God, like I now need a better filter because I have all this potential serendipity, but I need to filter a little bit. And I found that to be a really interesting question then, under which conditions do I want serendipity, right? So for example, when I started writing the book, I was like, great, I want to have all serendipity. I want to run into potential publishers. I want to run into potential case studies and so on and so on. And then once I knew what exactly I wanted to do, I was like, I don't want to run into anyone anymore. I want to go into the like coffee shop and kind of just focus on writing the things down and not being interrupted, not having distractions. And so I think it's also a lot about kind of building one's filters to say, now is a period where serendipity is great, but also now there's a serendipity, there's a period where I need a good filter that doesn't get me distracted.
Right. And just to like kind of recap a few of the tips we covered, it's like one, to kind of be open to the unexpected. Two, is like be curious. Three is like, scenarios where you want to be extroverted, and some scenarios where being introverted might help. And then you also talk about how you also want to calm your mind through like meditation and yoga. What role does that play in like increasing your luck?
That's a great question, because when you think about it, what makes us more alert to situations, it's really that we're present in a situation, right? That when I am present in a conversation with you, it makes it easier for me to spot a potential dot, to connect the dot, versus if I'm all over the place and I'm distracted and so on. And meditation really has that function of making us be more in the present, but also more importantly, it makes us more grounded in general, right? And I think the more grounded we are, the more we find kind of things that we actually want to connect dots with, right? I think people who are a lot all over the place, they might connect a lot of dots, but it might not be to the core of who they actually are. And so in meditation, the bigger picture, I think, behind a lot of this is also to say, what is it? Who do you want to be? Because serendipity is so much about potentiality. It's about what could be. And so the question always is, like, who do you want to become in some way? And a lot of this will be random at some point, right? But also then the more grounded you are, the more you can react to potentialities in more kind of grounded ways.
Yeah, and another one of my favorite studies about that is like talks about how when people are like stressed out or they're multitasking, I believe the experiment was count the number of images in newspaper, and people were so focused on that they missed out the words that said if you stop counting, we'll give you like $100 or something like that. And I think it just goes to show like if you're like kind of stressed out, how that could like impact, and you might miss a big opportunity.
Absolutely, and I think that's a great observation, because that was actually, I've always been fascinated by exactly those studies where, in a way, to your point, the more we are in fight or flight, or the more we have a particular goal that we want to achieve, the more we are missing the potentially really interesting things. And, you have that in a lot of contexts, right? I mean, I see that a lot in company contexts also, right? Where essentially you have people, and if you're the manager, you would say, we need to cut costs. And so if you tell someone to cut costs, they will now walk around and think about, oh, great, like, how can we fire this person? How can we do this to cut costs? Versus if I would have said, look, we're in a tough spot here, we need to do something to be able to survive, then that person might come and say, oh, actually, we don't have to cut costs because we can just bring in more revenue by having this new client here that I didn't even think about. Or, these kind of things where once you don't like over fixate people on a particular thing, but still the bigger issue behind it, then they can think about not only cost cutting, but also how to increase revenues and all these different types of things. And so it's really, in a way, finding that balance between over specifying and at the end of the day, leaving people a bit of wiggle room to actually find really creative solutions.
Yeah. And so Christian, we've been talking a lot about like kind of like scientific ways to like kind of like increase your serendipity. But one like lesson I really enjoyed also was about like manifestation, like the self-fulfilling prophecy. Because I found it also like, I guess, part of my life where I actually like visualized or like I manifested something and it actually came true. So could you kind of explain, like, is there like more of a science behind that, or is that more of an art of creating good luck?
That's a great question. I think there's a on the record and off the record answer probably to it, in the sense that on the record, the academic in me is like, I will probably only want to talk about like the things we can scientifically show. And so I think, and then the offline answer, I think there's wonderful answers. I can highly recommend, by the way, Bernard Beitman's book on synchronicity and connecting with coincidence, because he writes a lot about those things where we can't really grasp it scientifically, right? Like, I can't tell you why my friend feels when her sister was in an accident. I can't tell you this. I can't tell you what that is. We can't really measure it in some ways. There's this whole quantum physics question around it, and some call it then quantum mysticism. But I think Bernard is doing some really great work around trying to figure out, at this frontier of science, is there something we can learn that explains a bit more why some things happen energetically and in other ways. And so I think there's this whole thing that I think deserves a whole conversation in itself. And then on the scientific side, I think what I found really interesting is, when you think about what do you do when you manifest like some kind of objective, what you're doing is you're finding something where you now know that you want to see how you can connect dots to it, right? And so now, in a way, it gives you something that makes it easier to spot opportunities, because you can relate whatever you're seeing, you can relate to that thing now. And so I think that is, in a way, developing a certain focus that allows you to identify opportunities easier. It's like in a company, right? Like, I do a lot of work with executive teams, and when you have a leader who says, our bigger purpose here is that we want to lift 500 million people into the financial system as a MasterCard company, then if I'm an employee now and I talk with friends, I will, if a friend tells me, oh, hey, I have this solution that helps people in poverty get out of poverty, I'm like, oh my God, such a coincidence. My boss just told me about. So let me do something with it, right? So the point is, that's the same with individuals. If we have something that we can connect dots to, serendipity becomes much more likely. So long story short, I think there's things that are very tangible that can explain that. And then I think also there's probably other things that are about how you then also probably develop things that I can't explain, but I think there are other people who are really good at trying to grasp it at the frontiers of science.
Yeah, and yeah, you give people, you know, a heads up on the subtitle where you say it's an art, but it's also a science, and like maybe the science isn't 100% there, but it seems like, you know, you can't really go wrong like manifesting or kind of knowing what you want. And also relates to a tip you shared earlier, where it's like you want to be alert, you want to be on the lookout for what you want, and that alertness will help you like filter all the things going on in the world. And like if you spot what you're looking for, then it might feel like you manifested it, but it's really you just been on the lookout for it.
Exactly.
And so I want to dive into like more practical strategies. And another one I really enjoyed was called a Serendipity Bomb, which is a great name for it, by the way. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so that is really about saying most opportunities in life are about probability, right? Like in terms of the more shots you take on a goal, the more likely it is that you will score a goal, right? And so the idea here is that you do a couple of speculative things of putting some kind of mines out there that could go off, but you're not relying on them to go off. And so take the example of if you would be a new author and you would just write your book now, and you would say, I want 5 endorsements of really amazing people. Now, most of us won't have the context to just like call up like Jeff Bezos and say, Jeff, can you give me an endorsement for the book, right? So what we'll probably need to do is we probably need to somehow understand, you know, hey, which friends know interesting people? Can I get a warm introduction? But also we might go online and figure out, you know, what are the emails of the most interesting people or the Twitter handles, and then literally just send a lot of speculative messages to a lot of people along the lines of, hey, super inspired by you, you know, would love to see if there's something, and, you know, something that's win-win in some way. But the point really being that the more we can put speculative things out there, being that emails, LinkedIn, you know, second degree contacts, you can contact people of the people you know. So it's incredible how many people you can directly reach. But then also, you know, the Twitter, it's incredible how people like Adam Grant and others respond on Twitter, right? And other platforms. So the Serendipity Bomb is really about how do you put as many potential mines out there that could go off. And by doing that 100 times, there's usually 2 or 3 people who will say, wow, cool, such a coincidence. I was just about to mentor a young person and you're exactly the young person I wanted to mentor. Like, let's have a coffee. Something like this where it's a numbers game. And so essentially it's a lot about maximizing that.
Yeah, and 2 points I want to make on that is one's like when I first started this podcast, I thought like authors wouldn't come on, and like I emailed some authors that I thought like, oh, I had no chance of getting them on, and somehow they said yes. And then authors I thought, oh, okay, they're like a smaller author, they'll definitely come on. They said no, and it's really like you said, it's kind of like a numbers game, and like if you reach out to enough people, like sooner or later you'll get a response. And the other thing I really love is that you talk about how like luck isn't just something that happens to you, it's something you could kind of create. Like you kind of emailing all these people increases your chance of getting lucky versus just, you know, Jeff Bezos isn't going to just email you for no reason. But like you, I saw in your book, you got a testimonial from like Reid Hoffman and like a couple other great successful people. And it's like you want to take control of like your life and your luck. And there's certain things you could kind of do to increase that luck. So I think that's a really important tip for people as well.
Absolutely. And I feel, you know, to your point, what's really interesting is that I always had a very similar assumption to your initial assumption, right? That the quote unquote lower someone is in the hierarchy, the easier they are to reach. But actually not necessarily, right? Like it's fascinating how sometimes it's far easier to reach someone who's far higher up because they can be very selective and they can decide themselves, okay, hey, I could do this now, I could do this now, versus others might be in the kind of, you know, like relying on a lot of things, having to prove themselves in a lot of ways, whatever it is. The point is that a lot of times, actually, I think there's a lot of value at reaching out to the most senior of people who are out there, the most inspiring of people who are out there, and then really kind of seeing what happens. And a lot of times it's surprising how, to your point, it might be more likely that those kind of people get back to you than not.
Yeah, and especially you also have a section in your book where you talk about you really want to use like technology to your advantage. So like you say, get on social media, like you mentioned, get on Twitter, comment, share people's posts, and like you never know who you might like get a response from. And I think also like in my personal life, I probably made more friends this year online than in person. And I think it just speaks to the importance of kind of like using technology to kind of increase the surface area of luck in your life.
Absolutely. And that's, I love that a friend of mine, he called it Zoom, and those platforms are our own private planes at the moment, right? Like previously, it would take you so much time to travel to someone, like, you being in Brooklyn, I'm being here in the West Village, like it would have taken us such a long time, and, all these different things. And even more so with clients, like if there's a client somewhere in London, and then you have to fly to them and you have to do X, Y, Z. And now you can just like be in someone's living room, like literally within a second, right? And I think, again, of course, like, COVID and everything else has taken a lot away from us in terms of the deeper emotional connection that comes from being in the same room and so on. And I think at the same time, it also, to your point, has given us new ways of connecting quicker and potentially actually sometimes even deeper, because now I can ask you about the kind of books that are on your bookshelf behind you without feeling I'm intrusive in your life, right? Because you put them there for a reason, right? And so it's kind of these things where it makes it easier for all of us to, in a way, engage also maybe on other levels than we have usually been engaging on.
Yeah, definitely a lot of advantages. And yeah, it's, like you mentioned in your book, one of the important things is like reframing the situation. So sure, maybe you can't connect with people in person, but there are plenty of advantages of connecting with people online, which is like you don't have to travel. You kind of see what they're doing, kind of what books they're interested in reading. So it's all about like reframing your situation. And I think I actually wanted to ask you a question, which might be a little bit philosophical, but if you kind of reframe your bad luck, isn't it like, don't you always have good luck in the long run? Like for instance, like you got into that car crash, which may seem like bad luck, but in the long run, like you became the successful individual, and you also, I believe, you had to drop out of high school, and then you went on to get your PhD. So like if you always reframe your situation and you just don't quit, is it like you never have bad luck in a way? Or what do you take on that?
I love that question. I'm a philosopher at heart, so I definitely love the philosophical question behind. It's interesting. I always love that quote that says, if you want a happy ending, it depends on when you stop the story, right? And like if you stop the story too early, you won't have the happy ending. Like if you stop your story after a heavy breakup where your girlfriend really kind of pushed you out and you thought, oh my God, that was the love of my life and my life is over, and you stay in that state, then that is your life, right? Versus if you kind of then, open yourself up again, and then a couple of years later, you meet the person where you're like, oh my God, how could I even have like considered that other person? Like, this is the real love of my life. And so I think it's something where everyone who has gone through breakups or tough situations, especially near-death experiences, I think a lot of times it's really this, that those situations propel us in some way to something really interesting, right? When we look at it over a very long time. And so actually, I spent the last couple of weeks writing a new chapter for the paperback version of the book, which is coming out next year. And one of the things that I've been focusing on a lot is that COVID in a way was a collective near-death experience, right? COVID in a way was like bomb and like unexpected for everyone. And a lot of people, including myself, who had it, we felt, oh my God, life can be over very quickly, right? And so it's a really tough situation. And one of the things I've been thinking increasingly about is, how can you have similar kinds of situations that show you, wow, life, like, life can be over every day. So you better make it meaningful now versus waiting for the next 20 years and then make it meaningful. And so I've become a big fan of this disorienting dilemma, which is all about saying, how do you constantly put yourself into situations that challenge your assumptions so that you find the most meaningful way of how you can live your life? And I think those kind of situations, long story short, I think a lot of times are disorienting dilemmas, because they essentially say, you're in a situation here that tells you you're much more fragile than you think, your life can be over much quicker, and so, hey, let's do something with it. And the way we frame it then, to your point, if we frame it as something that is, oh my God, life is over, then that will be how it is. Versus if we say, hey, there's something we can do with it. And last point on this is really, I've been a big fan of Viktor Frankl, especially for his philosophy that he essentially always had that idea that, look, you cannot always pick the stimulus or the thing that happens, but you can always pick a response to it. You can always have agency in some way. And I think that agency is that creates then potential growth and potential serendipity.
Yeah, I remember there was a quote from his book, and that really stuck with me. Is like, you could take everything from a man except his attitude, and that's how he kind of survived the concentration camps. And I think that's probably my favorite lesson from your book is just constantly reframe your situation to like a positive, or like just keep an eye out on like, you know, any situation that happens to you, because there might be good luck. You know, I believe the chapter title was "Bad Luck Today Might Be Serendipity Tomorrow," and that's kind of just the way I'm starting to look at my life moving forward. So I really love that kind of mind shift your book gave me.
And, you know, it's interesting because that's also the incubation time a lot of times of serendipity, right? That in a way, a lot of times serendipity is not necessarily in the moment, right? It's not me bumping into you now and then we directly doing something. You might call me up in 5 years and say, Christian, such a coincidence. You know, I just bumped into the person who does a curriculum about this and this, like you should catch up. So the point is a lot of times the initial trigger might actually be something negative, right? And then over time, it's like, oh my God, actually that could be really positive. So it's really, again, a process versus just like a one-time kind of thing.
Right. And I think this goes back to what you mentioned earlier, the serendipity journal, where you want to kind of keep track of what's going on and kind of reflect on it. And yeah, you might, you know, remind yourself of the opportunity. And it's just wonderful how all of the kind of the advice you give in your book, kind of you could combine it to really compound that serendipity. And I know we kind of covered a lot of tips, but are there like one or two more practical tips listeners could use to kind of increase the luck and serendipity in their life?
Yeah. Well, I'm a big fan really of thinking about what are the things in my day-to-day that I'm anyways doing, and then how can I do it slightly differently so that I learn slightly more about people, you know, by asking questions slightly differently. So again, you know, if I have this weekly call with my parents, right, where in a way you have a routine and you talk about similar things, could you ask one or two questions differently just to see, you know? And what's fascinating is, you know, I have a lot of friends, for example, who've been trying this of asking different questions. And what happens then is that when they had to call the uncle they really didn't want to call, and they just asked like a couple of slightly different things. And they were like, oh my God, like I didn't even know my uncle is XYZ, or my uncle put me in touch with a potential client. That was really unexpected. And because what you did here is you opened the serendipity field up and you said, there's much more to that person or that situation than I had seen before. And so I think there's a lot about these kind of small things of just looking at what we're anyways doing, and then can I seed a little bit more into this. Bigger picture though, I'm a big fan of really thinking about how can I redefine every situation where I'm in, where I think there's some kind of scarcity. Because I think a lot of times, you know, we grew up with a scarcity mindset, right? We grew up with a mindset where we say, I need more budget, I need more this, oh my God, budget cut here, so I can't do this. And so I think there's a lot around this idea of how can I think about what I have and make the best out of that. And so there's this amazing organization in the Cape Flats in Cape Town that I'm a big fan of called Reconstructed Living Labs. And, you know, they come out of a community extremely crime ridden. It's a community extremely poor. And they have a low-cost education methodology, you know, things like 10 steps to use social media to build your business. And so what they do is they go into other communities of poverty, and instead of saying, what do you need? So instead of framing it around like needs and scarcity, they say, what's already here and how can we make the best out of this? Oh, there's a former drug dealer. Fantastic. That person will be extremely creative. They will have a lot of social capital, so they will know a lot of people. So if we can turn them into a teacher, they will make it cool to be a teacher. They will bring a lot of people in. And hey, there's an old garage. Great, that could be a training center. The point is we can reframe the situation in ways that allows us to connect the dots differently, because we're saying it's not about getting more. It's about thinking differently about the situation I'm in. And so I think, you know, from all the things, like all the kind of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of exercises and practices we could do, I'm a big fan of this kind of general attitude of saying, you know what? There will be a lot of situations in life that we don't choose. There will be a lot of budget cuts and other things. But if we always think about, okay, is there still something in this moment that we can still in this moment see as something that could actually be an opportunity, then it starts to happen all the time. And I think that's where it gets exciting, because then again, serendipity starts to happen.
Yeah, that's a super powerful way to look at the world. And I think just like a simple one that for me has been like, oh, when I used to commute, I used to think, oh, this is an hour commute, this sucks. And it's like, well, I could use that hour to like listen to a podcast, and I'm spending that hour educating myself, which is great because usually I'm too busy to like listen to a podcast. So yeah, like it's so important just to like reframe your situation. And like you said, you can't always respond what happens to you. You can't always choose what happens to you, but you do have the choice to respond to it. And so Christian, I know you also like kind of given a lot of talks and workshops to people. Are there any like big like myths around luck that people really like when you tell them, like it really kind of makes it really kind of blows them away, or kind of like they really didn't expect like a hard truth about it? Or is like what's like one thing people listening wouldn't know about serendipity or like creating their own luck?
I think one of the things that people usually assume is that it's either skill or luck, right? So it's either like, oh, you're lucky, or you have a skill and you work hard and that's that. And serendipity is really, these are people who worked really hard to be lucky. You know what I mean? Like it's really kind of, and that's really the muscle that I talked about. And I think that's something, getting away from that wrong dichotomy of either skill or luck, to say, no, this is skilled luck. This is like, it's a life skill to cultivate serendipity. And I think that's really something, that's the bigger shift in mindset that I feel is necessary, because, I work a lot with students, for example, and what I see in those students is similar to when I grew up, right? I grew up with this idea, you can plan life out, you can map it out, you can plan a career, and then life happens, and you're like, oh my God, oh my God. And so I'm a big fan of getting like rid of this illusion of control, this illusion that we can control everything, and rather say, it's not about controlling everything. It's about essentially making sure that we somehow develop a sense of direction, where approximately we want to go, and then really have this humility to say, I don't have it all figured out, and that's okay. And I find that really interesting especially when working with very senior executives, that when they go into a boardroom, right, they have to portray authority. So they come in and they want to say, I planned this, then I did this, and then this outcome happened. So like step by step by step. Even though everyone in that room knows, like, no, it was a bit more like a squiggle rather than like a straight line, right? Similar to our CVs, right? We will go into a meeting of a new employer with a new employer, and we'll say, oh, I did this, then I did this. But everyone knows you probably just, ran into someone at a conference, and then they like told you about a job you didn't even know about, and then you got in there, right? Point being that I think I'm a big fan of this idea that at the end of the day, we've for a long time seen the unexpected and serendipity as something that happens to us because maybe we didn't have a clear plan, or maybe, there wasn't something there. And I think one of the biggest goals I have with this work is to say, no, like, let's get away from this idea that this is passive. It's actually, you build a muscle that enables you to have more serendipity. Or as a leader, you build a culture that enables you to have more serendipity to happen. And that's not a bad thing. Actually, it's an active thing, and it's the only way to manage in uncertainty.
Yeah, I think that's gonna be my new favorite phrase, skilled luck. Because like, yeah, I think a lot of people know that like the harder they work, the luckier they get. But also that luck is a skill itself. Like we've been talking in this conversation, it's like you have to like talk with people, you have to look out for opportunities, you got to touch base, and like kind of take action on things or ideas that kind of keep coming back to you. So I think it's wonderful, especially for people that have a growth mindset. They'll realize that they can work towards getting luckier and having more serendipity in life. So I think that's wonderful news for everyone.
Yeah.
So, your book had like a big impact on me and the way I kind of look at luck now. I want to ask you, what are 2 books that had like a big impact on your life?
So first, with like so much distance in between that I can't even fathom, is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. That's really a book that I've been rereading it a couple of times, and I always see new things in there. It's very short, it's easy to read, it's highly recommended. And the core idea really is that, he was in a concentration camp, and I know that you've read it, so I'm sure you know, but just for the benefit of everyone listening who hasn't read it, like, it's essentially, he was in a concentration camp, which, as you can imagine, is the toughest situation that you can ever be in. And he said, you know what, you can take everything from me, but I will still do something that somehow gives me meaning here. And so what he would do is things like still talk with fellow prisoners to make them feel better, And by doing this, he would then have some kind of day-to-day meaning. And he also still wanted to write a book when he would come out of the concentration camp. And so he also had this bigger meaning. And I've always loved that. I do a lot of work around purpose-driven leadership. And one of the things that I'm always pushing for a lot is to say, it's not only about having this one big purpose and one big thing. You also need a day-to-day meaning. You need a day-to-day purpose. And so he, I think, beautifully in some way articulated how to combine kind of both the day-to-day purpose and the kind of bigger picture purpose. So that's definitely a book. And then being honest, like a lot of books from the old Greeks, like around Socrates, Plato, like, because I feel that when you look at especially Socrates, one of the things that I feel our education system nowadays is completely lacking is helping kids ask the right questions. It's one thing to know stuff, but like, it's a fast changing world, knowledge will be updated and whatever, but actually asking the right questions in the sense of like being inquisitive, questioning your assumptions all the time, being able to grow. A lot of the things we talked about today are based on the premise that someone actually wants to learn, that they want to challenge their assumptions, that they want to grow. And I think if we can build that at the core and really go back to the old Greeks and say, it's not about having the best solutions. It's not about having the quote unquote best beliefs or like best opinions, right? It's about asking questions that help us to really understand the world. And I think my hope there is that we read more books again that are more about asking questions than about kind of delivering the top solutions.
Yeah, learning how to think and like asking questions is definitely a valuable skill. And yeah, Man's Search for Meaning, incredible book. Highly recommend that. And just one more thing I want to ask about, because we've been talking about how to increase like your personal serendipity in life, but you also have like a portion of your book dedicated to like how to increase like serendipity in like a workplace or like if you own a business. Could you just share maybe like one piece of advice for any like business owners listening or executives?
Absolutely. And I think, for teams and businesses, I think one of the key things that are at the core is how do you build a culture that allows people to connect the dots for each other, right? To help each other out and to spot like the unexpected and then connect the dots to what you want to achieve as a business. And so I'm a big fan of very simple things. Like, for example, in the weekly meetings, can we build in one question that asks, what surprised you last week? Is there something that, you wouldn't have expected? And then something might happen, like, for example, which is one of my absolute favorite examples, by the way, the potato washing machine, where there was a company, in China, and they essentially produce washing machines and so on. And they got calls from farmers. And the farmers essentially told them, well, your crappy washing machine is breaking down. Well, why is it breaking down? Well, we're trying to wash our potatoes in it and it doesn't seem to work. So, if you are the kind of old school leader who has a very clear marketing plan and you have it all mapped out, you will probably say, no, like, don't wash your potatoes in this. We built this washing machine so that you can wash your clothes in this. So don't wash your potatoes in it. Now, if you're the kind of person who says, no, let's be open to customer feedback. Let's be open to what could be out there. You might say, hey, you know what? There's actually a lot of farmers in China who might have a similar problem. So why don't we build in a dirt filter and make it a potato washing machine, right? And so that in that case became that new potato washing machine. But more broadly speaking, the point here is that when we incentivize people to look out for the unexpected, that's when we find new types of products. That's when we respond differently to customer feedback. But also that's when we allow people to come up with these kind of things we would usually consider as crazy ideas. And, a company that has been doing this really well was Pixar, right? Pixar, one of the most creative companies in the world, they would constantly allow people to de-risk talking about ideas. They would say, at the beginning, most ideas are bad. You can still raise them in the meeting. That's okay. Right. And by legitimizing this, I think that does a lot for culture. So I think a lot of the culture questions are really around how do you make it a okay thing to essentially have ideas that might seem a little crazy, but they actually might be okay.
Yeah, and like you mentioned in the book, you want to have like you want to let employees feel safe to kind of discuss ideas. Yeah, because most ideas will probably be bad, honestly, but every now and then you'll find like that gem that really kind of could be something great. And yeah, just going back, I love how like every chapter has like practical advice and even like questions people could kind of look into. So if like if you're kind of busy or you don't have that much time to read the book, you could kind of go to the end of a chapter and just kind of get like the practical takeaways or like exercises that anyone could apply, which I found really helpful reading the book. And so, Christian, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I really enjoyed your book, and I'm sure our listeners did too. Where can people go to like learn more about you and learn more about your work?
So the homepage is serendipitymindset.com, and Twitter, I'm at Chris Serendip.
Well, Christian, I just want to thank you again for coming on the Reader Journey podcast with us today. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I've enjoyed it so much, and I learned a ton from your book, and I'm sure listeners will as well.
Thank you so much, Alex. Really appreciate the conversation, and thanks so much for the great questions. Thank you.
Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Reader's Journey. You can learn more about what was covered in today's podcast in the show notes below. If you enjoyed this podcast, the best way you can support it is by subscribing and leaving a positive review. If you're looking for reading tips or book recommendations, head over to alexandbooks.com. If you want to join my reading journey, you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter by searching for Alex and Books. That's all for now. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you soon. Read on, everyone.